Hi, I'm Greg Columbus. My guest this time is Jarrett Stepman. Jarrett writes for the Daily Signal, which is affiliated with the Heritage Foundation, and he's also the author of The War on History, The Conspiracy to Rewrite America's Past. We wanted to get his insights as activists take aim at statues, monuments, and other tributes to figures throughout our history, from Columbus to the founders and beyond. And Jarrett, thanks so much for being with us.
Oh, thank you so much for having me.
Well, we've talked about this in different contexts before, sometimes around Columbus Day and so forth. But in terms of what we're seeing right now, the intense protests in the wake of the killing of George Floyd, I'm sure you're not overly shocked that once again we're seeing efforts to tear down monuments and statues commemorating figures from the Confederate era in our history. But how surprised are you at how quickly that focus pivoted to people like Columbus or Jefferson, who said all people are created equal, although obviously a slave owner, and even folks like Winston Churchill?
Yeah, honestly, I'm not that surprised about these developments. I saw kind of where this was going even a few years ago, and it's interesting that, especially, we have this debate over a lot of these Confederate statues and whatnot, but it's interesting that a lot of the statues have been defaced, not just Jefferson, but a lot of the Union heroes from the Civil War as well. I mean, in Washington, D.C., we had a statue of Admiral Farragut, who was a Southerner, but decided to join the Union Army, was actually a hero at the Battle of Mobile Bay, was instrumental in the Union victory in the war. And we've seen now also Abraham Lincoln statues get defaced. In fact, there's one statue in Boston of Abraham Lincoln depicted with the freed slave that many activists say they want to take down. So I think I'm not shocked by the escalation of this. I think that this was coming years ago. I think it follows from the rhetoric a lot of the activists who, frankly, they don't want to just war on the Confederate States of America, which was buried over 150 years ago. I think their aim is much greater, and there's a reason why this is not just happening here in America, but it's also happening in Great Britain. Targeting Winston Churchill. Winston Churchill is a symbol of Western civilization. Ironically enough, even though many of these activists call themselves Antifa or anti-fascists, Winston Churchill stood, frankly, for Western civilization against the rise of fascism, of Nazism, of some of the most terrible ideologies in human history. It's interesting that is the statue, among many others, that has been targeted. And I think it is because, in large part, what Winston Churchill symbolizes. He symbolizes the strength of the West. He symbolizes Western civilization.
So let's dig deeper into that, because the way we're hearing it from the media is, well, these are flawed figures. Maybe they're not worthy of this particular honor of having a statue and so forth. But you're saying there's a deeper motivation, that there's an antipathy towards Western civilization. Why do these people want these figures erased from history, essentially? And why are they so negative on Western civilization?
I think they have a utopian outlook. I think they think that if they simply wash away the old West, they can usher in something new. And what that something new is, it's very hard to say. A lot of their goals, I think, are quite unclear. And unfortunately, I think that means ultimately washing away a lot of the ideas and the most important aspects of Western civilization that preserve liberty and freedom. I think, obviously the rights that we have protected by the Constitution, I think a lot of these people, they don't have that limitation. They simply want to shut up and silence those who oppose them. They simply want to, this is straight power politics. Right now they're targeting statues, but I think a lot of these people, they look around, they look at how Western civilization is created, and they think, well, this is actually just hopelessly racist and imperialist. And really it just needs to be brought down. It needs to be brought down from the very root. And I think that's why you've seen things like, for instance, the 1619 Project of the New York Times, which tries to define the United States not in how it was birthed in liberty with slavery as a part of its heritage, but slavery as the very central part of America, of the United States. And while I think certainly that those essays in the 1619 Project were deeply flawed and in many cases simply inaccurate, I think they do represent a larger ethos that essentially America and a lot of the Western civilization was simply rotten at its very core, that it needs to be stripped of all of what it was and made into something new. And again, what that something new is, one can only say, especially as we see, mobs descend on statues and things along these lines. what exactly is that going to be replaced with? I think it's clear that it's not necessarily going to be something that's better than what came before.
One of the things that has come out of this, I think, Jarrett, is a greater understanding that a big chunk of this population now is largely historically illiterate. Either they haven't had the chance to study history, or they've studied it in a way that is highly skewed, with Howard Zinn as their textbook or something like that. And so how much do you think that's playing into what we're seeing here, that even people who realize we probably shouldn't be tearing all this stuff down don't know enough history to explain why it shouldn't happen?
Well, I think that's a huge part of this, and certainly the teachings of Howard Zinn. It's notable that a lot of the statues that are under attack are specifically the Christopher Columbus statue. Zinn, in his book, A People's History of the United States, in particular, went after Columbus. Now, again, Zinn is, to my mind, was a very dishonest historian. In fact, he's been very much a lot of his histories are simply inaccurate. He made up a lot of quotes. He made up a lot of things about Columbus and a lot of other people. But these books are used very widely in American classrooms, especially at the high school level. And I think that Zinn had a very clear message. I mean, Zinn was he was a member of the Communist Party USA. He had a very deep agenda. And I think we're seeing that bearing fruit. I mean, this is the generation of Zinn. I mean, for me and a lot of millennials, that's what they grew up on. That's really all that they know. So you have people that are going after Columbus statues, but also doing completely ridiculous things like, some activists went after a monument in Boston to the 54th Massachusetts, which, as many people have seen the movie Glory, was actually a black regiment in the Civil War. What that has to do with, supporting white supremacy or something like this, I have no idea. But I think that, you see with a lot of these attacks, it's simply, they see a statue and, well, that just must represent the past. It must represent racism. It must represent something terrible. Bring it down. And so I think you're getting a lot of that. And I think when you combine that with the kind of zealotry that you've seen from a lot of these, protests and sometimes often mobs, I think that's what you get. The end result is that you get just, every target that can be found must go. And I think that's the really scary part of this, is that, there is no limiting factor. I mean, was the limiting factor really Confederacy, or was it something else? And I don't think we've seen that limiting factor. I think it's going to its furthest reaches. And, I worry very much, what's the next step in all this?
There's been some folks, Jared, who have suggested that this is erasing history. It's akin to Stalinist tactics, and Mao did the same thing in China. Is that going too far as an analogy, or is it reminiscent of how communists generally try to whitewash the past?
It very much is. I think it also goes to, larger aims to simply silence those who disagree with the narrative. And I think that, especially as we see, especially on the far left, it really is all about narratives. It's about being politically correct, not necessarily correct. I mean, if it was simply about being, accurate and being, especially in history, why would the 1619 Project have won a Pulitzer Prize despite its inaccuracies, despite even its corrections? This is not about accuracy. It's about going with the narrative. And if frankly, if you cross that narrative, or if you don't go along with it, you can be quickly erased. You can be quickly gotten rid of. I mean, this is all part of, I think, with the general cancel culture that we see in America. This thing really arose, I think, on our college campuses first. Most people wrote it off as just, it's, craziness on college campuses. But now we're seeing that now America is the college campus, and we're seeing some of the nuttiness of this. And I do hope that people with common sense will start to take a step back and say, we're not going to stand around as all of our history is buried. Our history certainly isn't perfect. Human beings are fallen. I mean, mankind is fallen. Not everything we've gotten from history came from saints and came from perfect angels. And I think it's important to recognize that. I think it makes us better as a people if we can recognize the great things that we got from imperfect people. I mean, certainly we today are not a perfect people by any stretch. And I think that that's going to continue to be the case in the future. I think this kind of idea that we can simply erase anything that makes us uncomfortable or doesn't exactly conform to how we think today is a very dangerous idea. It's a dangerous idea that you can simply, through force, make the world in whatever image you want it to be. And I think that is a very, I think, ultimately authoritarian message, and very much against, I think, what this country was ultimately built on, what its real heart is, which was ultimately preserving liberty, preserving, finding the truth. As difficult as that is often is to find, the truth is, it's why we have things like the First Amendment. It's why we have things, why the founders created the system that we have. And I think a lot of these, especially the rioters and especially the mobs who descend on the statues, I think they're very much against that. I think they think that they can destroy the old world and create a new one in their own image. And I think it's a very dangerous and authoritarian idea.
Well, the famous line, of course, from the historian George Santayana was, those who do not learn from history are doomed to repeat it. So if you erase it, you're almost guaranteed to repeat some of the ugliest moments in history. But for the immediate and the long term here, Jarrett, how do the people who want to preserve and teach the actual history fight back here? Because it looks like every institution is against them. Academia for a long time has been. The media certainly seems to have no interest, by and large, for the most part, in correcting what's going on right now. So whether you're trying to save the local monument or whether you're trying to figure out how the next generation can get history taught to them correctly, how do we do that?
Well, first of all, don't join in on the general cancel culture. I think that's one of the big parts that's fueling this. And I realize that's something sometimes very difficult. People will have to be brave at this time in which, the cancel culture is absolutely ruthless. So I think that's step one. I think step two is, even in this age in which information to a certain extent is constrained by those who do want to cancel, there is a wide amount of information available. There are a lot of materials. I think, for instance, if you want to correct the excesses of the 1619 project, there's a 1776 project by the Woodson Center, which is absolutely fantastic, which actually corrects a lot of the message of 1619. I believe very strongly, especially when it comes to American schools, especially at the K-12 level, I believe very strongly in the idea of school choice. I mean, if your child is in a school that is teaching, I think, radical anti-American ideas, you should have the ability to take your child out of the school, or at least be able to put pressure on the school to make changes. And I think that's an incredibly important option. I think more people are going to have to see that as a way to give their child a better education, to give them an education in citizenship, and that is sorely lacking. I mean, we've had now many generations, in my opinion, of public schools that have failed young Americans, have led us to this point where we're incapable of even discussing history at a basic level because, we don't know it. And I think that is a massive problem. The information is out there. It's about getting those resources to those young people so that they can kind of create that bedrock of information. I hope I at least did a little bit of that in my book, The War on History, and trying to correct the record on a lot of America's past and show that, yes, America has been flawed, but is ultimately a great country, one worthy of celebrating, one that has created incredible prosperity and incredible freedom for more people than any country in history. And I think that's an important message that needs to continue. And so I hope that others will, maybe at this time, even be brave and be willing to stand up for the founding fathers. I mean, if you can't, I mean, who's going to? And I think that that's an incredibly important thing at this time, especially for American conservatives. I mean, that's, if we are conservatives, we need to conserve the greatest parts of our civilization. This is a time to be brave and stand for that. There's a lot of Americans. You think about the Patriots of 1776. Up to the men who stormed Normandy. I mean, these were incredibly brave men, in the face of gunfire. We have to be brave in defending them, defending what they built, defending ultimately what they created for us, which is a very precious thing in a history that is filled with a lot of tyranny, with a lot of violence, with a lot of evil. We have to be brave at this moment and stand for the good things about American civilization instead of just watching, people around us tear it all down.
Well, I certainly do recommend The War on History, The Conspiracy to Rewrite America's Past. Not only does Jarrett walk us through some of the efforts to discredit and erase folks like Columbus, the Pilgrims, the founders, and then on closer to our present day, but he also explains what the real history is and why our history is worth cherishing despite its flaws, whether it's here in the United States or Western civilization at large. So I recommend that. Jarrett, always good to talk to you. Thanks for your time today.
Thank you very much.
Jarrett Stetman writes for the Daily Signal, which is affiliated with the Heritage Foundation in Washington. And again, the book is The War on History. I'm Greg Corombos reporting for Radio America.